your PowerPoint. So, Dr. Usman, take it away.
Thank you, Nadeem Zaman Saab. It's my pleasure to be addressing the Pakistani-American community. My perspective will be situated in the economics, and I'd like to share with you a certain style of thinking and a certain orientation of thinking about how things might proceed between the United States and Pakistan in the next administration, with ramifications beyond that. So I'm struggling a little bit with my slides, but the structure is this. We will talk about the backdrop in which everything is happening, which is coronavirus. I think it's very important for the community to understand, especially people abroad, question why Pakistan has done so well and what that means for Pakistan's future and how it contrasts with the United States. I will build a little bit, or add a little bit to the very important remarks made by Ambassador Jalil Abbas Jilani about the Quad and China, because that's important for our orientation. There is a positive to talk about, which is CPEC. It's a positive driver, and then there's a negative driver I'll contrast that with, which is the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, which we call FATF here. And then some conclusions about that that are not just economic, but socioeconomic and political as well. So let's start with the coronavirus aspect. If you look at the graph, the United States with its number of cases is astronomical. India is catching up quickly. Brazil is also very high. And if you look at Pakistan, is way down there at the bottom, which strikes people as something surprising at the very least. Deaths on this slide, similar. The deaths are very high in the United States as well. This is not a surprise to you. You hear it 24/7 on the news, but it's important to understand why Pakistan has survived it so well. And one thing that they complain about in the news is that Pakistan simply wasn't doing enough testing. I believe this to be false, because if you look at the positivity rate of Pakistan, India, and the United States is below 10%. So I simply don't buy that argument that you're not testing enough people, because there's plenty of people who are being tested and there are just not enough positive cases. So who are you going to test? So I simply don't buy that. And I think it's a very good thing that we have such a low rate of cases. Pakistan's success comes in two parts. One is the structural factors. It's our demography and stuff, and the other is policy. So when you look at our structural aspects, the first thing is that we are a young population. 70% of us are under the age of 30. I'm an old man in this country. Our obesity rate is also very low. It's 8%. Interestingly, India's is even lower, a vegetarian society, 4%. So you would think both would do well, but Pakistan did well because its obesity rate is low. In the United States, according to the World Health Organization, it's 36% obese, not overweight, but obese. You see those people. I mean, Nadeem Zaman Saab, you're in Texas, you get quite a few of those folks down there. So obesity is a very big problem in America, and that has had repercussions because of the comorbidity between having obesity and the factors in your vital organs that are reproduced. Our conservative culture is a big part of this because women do not occupy the public sphere as frequently and as frivolously in this society as they do in other countries where both men and women have to hustle. That has actually been a positive. Say what you will about conservative cultures, you may have your value judgments. I don't, but I see the merits for conservative cultures when it comes to quarantine, because an Iranian study has shown that about 90% of people in Pakistan who did get COVID were men. So the low urban design, low rises, you don't have to go through elevators and that stuff. So the structure of our cities actually helped a lot too. And then the BCG vaccination is hypothesized to help because BCG was meant for tuberculosis, but it has a non-specific immunity for leprosy. And it's believed that it also has one for coronavirus, but this has to be tested. And the rate of BCG testing in Pakistan is 86%. In India, it's 90%. Another reason you would think they would do well, but they didn't. The policy factor is where we did very well, and that's because we had smart lockdowns. Prime Minister Imran Khan said, I simply cannot close down this economy, people will starve. And so you had, for example, in this city where I am, Islamabad, you had a G6, G7, I-10, I-9, like that. Wherever there was a case, you would lock down, but society was still continuing its progress. There is a lot of social solidarity in Pakistan. This is heartening for the Pakistani-American community to realize, is that maybe it's that Islamic culture or whatever, that hamdardi, that sympathy with the dispossessed. And so people were looked out for here. That is not true of India, for example, because there's a Hindu-Muslim divide as well, the caste system, where Brahmins are simply not expected to take care of the untouchables, for example. That's what really made them panic over there. The tireless work of our doctors, many of the audience are doctors as well. You know how hard the people have been working. That's universal. It helped. Protecting our rural areas was key because this hospital and the healthcare facilities in the rural areas are simply not good enough. So we were not letting people go into the rural areas. Wherever you were at the time of lockdowns, that's where you stayed. That was important. In India, people panicked and fled for the countryside, created community transmission pools, and then brought that back to the cities. And that was a disaster. stimulus program, about 5% of GDP, roughly, if you add different variants and elements of what the state bank has done in terms of putting loans forward, putting actual money into the system, et cetera. It's a very large amount given how restrained our resources are. And so because of this, Pakistan, alhamdulillah, has succeeded in keeping the coronavirus down, but the consequences of this permeate into the economic sphere. So if you look at the GDP growth quarter on quarter for the last quarter versus the year before, 2019, India is devastated, Spain, United Kingdom, et cetera, and China is the only one on this graph that looks bad. It doesn't mention Pakistan, so on the following slide, I have presented what the forecasts are. Pakistan will only get about a 0.4% drop. It's really not the end of the world. I mean, lockdowns did have their impact, but the forecasts are that in the subsequent financial year, there'll be a growth of 2%, which is remarkable that we would have this economic growth, so that the stasis has not come into the economic momentum for Pakistan. And the GDP growth rate, if you look at South Asia, apart from societies that are very isolated and small like Bhutan and Nepal, Pakistan does fairly well. Maldives, which is tourism-based, is devastated. India, because of its mismanagement, is devastated, but Pakistan is fine. So I'm very, it heartens me to report that. But GDP is just one element of the problem that we see here. Inflation is the other thing that's big, but that is not coronavirus dependent. The reason that Pakistan's inflation rate right now is hovering around 8 to 10%, possibly higher, is because of Tiddidal, the locust infestation, and Selab, so the floods. And those are climate-related issues. The locust swarm here is because of climatic patterns changing in the Middle East and then devastating Africa and South Asia. That is a global problem. We have to work together. And as Pakistani-Americans, you have to advocate this to your political establishment that you should not ignore the science. We all have to work together on this, the Paris Accords, for example, and that sort of thing. And the same for floods. So those parts of our economy are being attacked, but that's a global problem. I'm not going to spend too much time on the ideology and the China and the Quad element because Sir Jalil Abbas covered this meticulously, but the thinking of Uncle Sam is to cordon off through at least 4 powers and then the Quad plus, as Sir Jalil Abbas said, that it's to contain China. A lot of the policies that have been undertaken by the United States to punish China have actually backfired. As this excellent cartoon says, there's a bazooka of the trade war, but the damage of that has actually hit Uncle Sam more than it would the Chinese. And the Chinese have retaliated at about the same tariff levels across the rates and the product categories that would strike at Uncle Sam. And the reason that this is so difficult to do, you try to punish China economically, is that there's so much entanglement of the economies of the United States and China. So if China says, if things don't improve between us, I will walk away in anger, and then the United States says, no, I will walk away in anger, but there's so much entanglement of supply chains, of investment, it's simply not possible to do that overnight. It would take a very long time. Basically, over the last 20 years, a lot of the earnings per share growth in the Fortune 500 companies has come from their China story, both the markets as well as the supply chain. So to disentangle from that is not something that corporate America really wants. Here's a cartoon from Southeast Asia where it says there's the Chinese bully and the US bully, and Southeast Asia has to pick a side. I don't want to categorize the United States or China as bullies. I don't buy that. And Pakistan doesn't buy that either. As Sir Jalil Abbas mentioned, Pakistan would ideally like to strike a positive balance between both and be a bridge. Mueed Yusuf Saab, our national security advisor, said if one country does 10 projects in Pakistan, the other country should do 20 projects in Pakistan, and that would be very, very good for us and for them. So we're not looking to pick sides. But here's the thing. As far as this is the United States ambassador designate, William Todd. He was asked about his priorities in his congressional confirmation, and the main elements that were mentioned were Afghanistan, India, terrorism, nuclear, etc. I didn't hear enough about economics because they still view us through the prism of violence. We are the imagined other as the bad guy, the scapegoat for their misadventures around the world. And it's part of that Islamophobic streak as well. And so economics simply doesn't come in their mind. As the Pakistani-American community, I urge you to lobby hard to add this lens into our perception of the relations, that economics is important and should be really at the top of this list, but they don't. And that's the problem. In the meantime, China does view a shared co-prosperity, in Mandarin, they view it as part of their vision for the world beyond them. CPEC is one part of that. It is in phase 2 now. Phase 1 already has occurred with the basic layout of infrastructure across energy, highways, and so on. Now phase 2 involves a larger private sector element, and then there'll be a phase 3. And this is phased out over a longer period. It's a $62 billion project, and what Pakistan was really starving for was not talent, it was starving for capital. This is the capital that lays the infrastructure for Pakistanis, both residing here and the diaspora, to build upon. So there are hostile narratives to that. You hear some skepticism in America, but you especially hear it in India, as this cartoon shows that elephant trudges on its own momentum because Pakistan and China are committed to it, but India is trying to hold it back. It's not succeeding. Here are some images of, for example, the Gwadar Coastal Highway, the Gwadar Port, power stations, etc. Literally, the architecture is being changed quietly. There isn't so much fanfare. It happens silently, and it's the foundational architecture for a new economy, a 21st century economy. That's the good side, but now I want to talk a little bit about a negative that's important. It's the Financial Action Task Force. This is a self-appointed watchdog that looks at how countries are doing in terms of terrorist financing and money laundering. It was created in 1989, and it was meant to stop basically the illegal transfer of funds from the Soviet Union republics, former Soviet Union republics, into Western Europe. After 9/11, it became a kind of scapegoat to punish countries if it was suspected that there was terror financing. It's been blown out of proportion. Pakistan has been put on the gray list and been threatened with the blacklist. I have studied it quite intimately and found it to be a sham. And the reason is the new FinCEN leaks as corroboration of that. Yes, Pakistan's systems work in the informal, and that's just how the developing world is. That's how the third world is. But to punish it so severely doesn't make sense. And the scope of that was provided by FinCEN. FinCEN is an arm of the United States Treasury where banks submit suspicious reports. And when you looked at the 2000 leaks that came out in the 2000 documents, it was about $2.2 trillion in scope. And the biggest perpetrators were JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, Bank of New York Mellon, etc. India was 800 million out of that. Pakistan was $2 million. And all of India's major financial institutions were at some degree implicated. That doesn't mean they're guilty, but that means that they have found something suspicious and they didn't do anything about it. And so the way this is working in terms of money laundering and terrorist financing and sanctioning Pakistan simply does not make sense in the scope of things. Pakistan's economy isn't even that large, but theirs are large. And if you really want to fix money laundering in the world, you'd go straight to New York. You'd go to Frankfurt and London. So I think that as Pakistani-Americans, it's important for you to familiarize yourself with FATF, what it does, and why it is picking on Pakistan in such an irrational manner, given the scope of things. Now, where is the US direction headed? This is visceral for you. I don't need to tell you how these things are happening. But in terms of the economy, you've seen how many people are out of work. You know people who are out of work. The US economy is like this horse that has fallen over. But what is Wall Street being propelled by? This is Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, chairman of the Fed. And he is basically putting the silly horse hat and is pushing the economy forward. So it's based on an artifice of several $1 trillion being printed. And so Wall Street looks very good. And the Trump administration pushes the fact that the economy is soaring. But the reality of American economic life is very different. And this will have repercussions into the next administration, perhaps beyond. Here is the S&P 500. It doesn't show the slight decline in the last 2 days after it was known that President Trump contracted coronavirus, but that's not important. I want to look at the 5-year trend. And what you see here after 2020 is basically there was the coronavirus drop and it's risen all the way back to the top as if the virus never took place. And this is how out of touch American capitalism is with the American ordinary folk. And I think this is very bad for the global economy as well as for the United States because it's being put on a kind of ventilator, to use the coronavirus metaphor. What's in store? The FBI actually says that Islamic terrorism is not the biggest thing right now. It's these white nationalists and these types of things. Civil rights, human rights, you name it. There's a lot of violence. So all of you, I urge you to stay safe because the sort of leaks that are happening, what game theorists are saying about it, things could get quite ugly there. And I actually would feel safer in Islamabad than in just about any American city now. And I think this is very worrying. And what that means for America overall is that while it has so many internal rifts, its external policy is not strong. If it does want to challenge China and bring Pakistan, drag it along in that, it's not in a good negotiating position to do that. So here is a knight in the US trade policy and it's asking China, are you scared yet? And the Europeans are saying, well, that's quite an unusual negotiating position because right now what the world needs, especially in coronavirus, is for a cooperation in keeping the international system and its institutions alive. Pakistan strongly advocates for that international cooperation. It also argues strongly for debt relief for the third world. I think that the architecture of the economy globally really needs to be reconsidered. And the US does have a leadership position in that. As Pakistani-Americans, you have to articulate that Pakistan is an important player in that. It wants to play along with the global system and it wants to contribute its little part. So in conclusion, I want to say that things could get ugly, but I want to also look at the positive. Pakistan's view on race relations, all of this strife, is very much conciliatory. Pakistan wants to have good relations with India, with Afghanistan, and so on, with America, working together to build a new architecture in such a difficult time. And I think it's captured best by this truck art, which was in memory of George Floyd. And it's actually the caption on the side, which says, "Na goron ki, na kalon ki, ye duniya hai dil walon ki." And I think this captures the spirit of Pakistan today. And it's something that as Pakistani Americans, it resonates with you. It's just that the world around you is changing so fast. So stick to these precepts of the Pakistan psyche. Na goron ki, na kalon ki, ye duniya hai dil walon ki. And with that, I'd like to return the mic to Sir Nadeem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Usman. That was wonderful. And I especially would like to have an access to the slide that you had about terrorism.